the so so let's begin with the question first. The Scarpa's fascia, which of the among is the false statement? Can anybody answer? You can leave the answer in the chat box. Scarpa's fascia, which is a false statement. Right. So bulk of subcutaneous fat is usually formed by the campus fascia, not by the Scarpa's fascia, and the rest of the statement is correct. So we all know the layers of the abdominal wall. We don't need to go in detail of the layers of the abdominal wall. Campus fascia is the superficial adipose layer, and the main bulk of the subcutaneous fat is formed by the campus fascia only, while Scarpa's fascia is a deep, denser, fibrous connective tissue layer, which aids in the alignment of skin for incision. Now, which among the following is false? Okay, so answer is A. The superficial epigastric vein, it drains below the abdominal wall, below the umbilicus. So the answer will be A. So below the umbilicus, veins are usually superficial epigastric vein, then our circumflex iliac vein, and the pudendal vein. While above the umbilicus, we have our internal mammary vein, intercostal, and the long thoracic vein. And for the lymphatic drainage, we all know above umbilicus, they all will go to axillary lymph nodes, and below will be going to superficial inguinal group of lymph nodes. And innervations, usually thoracic nerve 7 to 12 will be there, which they will pass behind the costal cartilage and the lower ribs. They will enter the plane between internal oblique muscle and the transverse abdominis initially, and they will pierce the rectus sheath to provide sensory innervation, uh, just medial to linea semillinaris. Now, the iliohypogastric nerve, which is the true statement. Okay. So the true statement is B. The iliohypogastric nerve usually emerges through superior crus of external inguinal ring. While the third statement, which is C, pierces transverse abdominal muscle, this part is correct, but it doesn't pierces external oblique aponeurosis, and it doesn't travel above the external oblique aponeurosis. So the ilioinguinal nerve and iliohypogastric are the two nerves which are mostly important in our inguinal canal or for inguinal hernia surgery. So ilioinguinal nerve, we all know the nerve which is lying along with the spermatic cord. The nerve, this is the nerve which will be present with the spermatic cord, and it will come out with the spermatic cord through external ring only. While iliohypogastric nerve, they usually travels between transverse abdominal muscle and internal oblique muscle for a short distance, and they'll pierce the internal oblique muscle, then travel under the external oblique aponeurosis later. Then they further come out to the superior crus of external inguinal ring. And the sensory innervation, we all know the ilioinguinal nerve will provide in inguinal region, scrotum and labium, while iliohypogastric in the hypogastric region. Ilioinguinal nerve, if the relation to spermatic cord we ask, then it will be located anterior to the spermatic cord. And iliohypogastric nerve usually said it is lying medial and superior to internal nerve. Now this is the diagram from the SWOTs. It's not very important, just various named abdominal incision. You can go in later. It's not a very important thing. Now next, which of the following statement is correct regarding diastasis recti? Correct. So all of the following statement are correct for the diastasis recti. So diastasis recti is usually transverse fascia will be intact, so there will be no hernia, there will be thinning of linea alba, and there will be no infile facial margins, and there will be no risk of intestinal strangulation also. Rectus sheath hematoma, which is correct statement. Okay, correct. They may present in young female, and rest of the statement is wrong. They usually caused by the disruption of inferior epigastric artery, not the superior epigastric artery, and they are more common in females. So the rectus sheath hematoma nowadays mostly seen in the older age group and the female elderly, and most common cause is the trauma or injury. They might be associated with sometimes cough. In young females, sometimes it is associated with the pregnancy. The commonest culprit is the inferior epigastric artery or its branches, and some series it has been said the most of the cases are has been associated with anticoagulant therapies. They will present with the abdominal wall mass most of the time. They might be tender and there might be voluntary guarding. Might be there will colon or great anal sign will be seen. Most of the cases will be managed conservatively with breast and analgesic. Rarely they may need a angiographic embolization. No. Desmoid tumor of abdominal wall, which is a false statement. Correct. Desmoid tumor usually doesn't have a risk of metastasis, then no lymph node invasion also. They are usually very highly aggressive, invasive, multifocal will be there, but they are usually said have a lack. They lack the metastatic potential. They might be inherited or might be sporadic. Majority are sporadic only, and few cases can be associated with FAP and Gardner syndrome. After resection, there will be always a high chance of recurrence. They have a usually thousandfold high risk in case of FAP and more commonly seen in female patients. In young women during pregnancy or within a year of childbirth, there is a high risk of developing desmoid tumor. There has been associated with the female hormones, OCPs, or previous incision is also a risk factor. They usually present as a asymptomatic mass. Sometimes symptom may be present because of mass effect. Now, the Swartz right desmoid tumor is the primary cause of death in FAP after prophylactic colectomy. And the poor prognosis for the desmoid tumor is large size, young patient, and intraabdominal tumor location. On CT scan, desmoid tumor will look homogeneous, while in MRI, T1 will have a homogeneous isointense, but T2 will have a heterogeneous appearance, and they will be less intense than FAP. Biopsy is not very important for desmoid tumor. No one is going to ask the biopsy. The point we just need to remember, which mentioned belly, plasmodal, cell and central mixometer changes might be seen. Desmoid tumor false statement is
C, sir.
correct. So the answer is vimentin usually is positive in the desmoid tumor, right? So and I see beta catenin actin vimentin. The this three will be positive. Cytokeratin and actin will be negative in desmoid tumor. Abdominal wall desmoid, true statement. Okay. So answer is D. Right. So some case may regress without any treatment. They are usually radio sensitive, and you have a 40 to 45% response to our tamoxifen. So 50% will not progress in short-term follow-up. Up 10% may have a spontaneous regression, and selected patient we may go for conservative approach. They are usually very highly radiosensitive tumor, but for alone radiotherapy treatment is not given until unless patient is having high morbidity or an unresectable tumor is there. Neoadjuvant treatment neoadjuvant radiotherapy for desmoid usually is the less accepted hypothesis, and because it has a slow response time, often more than 1 year might be required. Adjuvant, it's a controversial topic again. Only in case of positive and close margin, adjuvant radiotherapy should be given. Now, in case of locally advanced recurrent or resectable tumor, uh, estrogen receptor antagonist or NSAID or systemic chemotherapy can be given. Tamoxifen, the response can be seen is 40 to 50%, but initially slow onset response is there, but the response can often last for several years. FAP desmoid, tamoxifen, high dose tamoxifen and Sulindac is the initial treatment of choice for FAP desmoid mentioned in Sebastian. Now, the methotrexate with bindblastin, doxorubicin, and ifosfamide, the positive response is seen in 20 to 40%. Doxorubicin and dacarbazine given in the patient with desmoid which have a rapid growth rate. Imatinib has also been studied in the studies. Intra-abdominal desmoid, which is true statement. Right. They are often multiple. Most of the time they are intra-abdominal, and intra-abdominal mostly they involve the mesentery. So, mesenteric or intra-abdominal desmoid, less than 10% sporadic desmoid we will see as a mesenteric desmoid. In fact, 10 to 15% patient will develop mesenteric or intra-abdominal desmoid. While overall desmoid in FAP, most of the cases will be intra-abdominal, and among those, most of the cases will be seen in the mesentery only. Now, they are mostly, more often they are multiple and more lethal, and resection will be less possible. They may involve ureter, and initially they have a very rapid growth, but they may get stable and may even get regress. So that's why the 10-year survival of this tumor is around 60 to 70%. They usually have a high complication rate with the intestinal obstruction, ischemia, perforation, hydroureter nephrosis. So in case of small tumor, resection with clear margin is advised, and but recurrence is higher than the other sites. In case of abdominal desmoid, the recurrence was high, but in mesenteric desmoid, recurrence rate is even higher than the other sites. It will be around 57 to 86%. Intra-abdominal desmoid in FAP. True state.
False B for rest are true.
Oh, right, right. The false is when we forgot to mention the false. So, Sulindac can be used in the early stage. Sorafenib can be used in higher stage, especially stage 3, and 20 centimeter more than size is stage 4. Sorafenib is not used in stage 4. Here, false we have forgot to mention. So, answer is D. Now, the staging system for intra-abdominal desmoid usually 10 centimeter with no symptom and no growth, they will be stage 1. 10 centimeter with mild symptom or the growth of less than 25% in 6 months, stage 2. Stage 3, 11 to 20 centimeter, moderate symptom, 25 to 50% growth, or more than 20 centimeter, severe symptom, or more than 50% growth will be stage 4. So, Sulindac usually given in early stages, and Sulindac with Raloxifene is given in stage 2, while methotrexate, vinorelbine, or sorafenib is given in stage 3. Doxil and erythromycin is given in stage 4. Now, the abdominal wall sarcoma. The true statement is so. Answer is C. The abdominal wall sarcoma usually doesn't metastasize commonly. They will present mostly as a painless mass, and resection is needed with proper margin. But for definitive diagnosis, one either incisional biopsy or a true cut biopsy, core biopsy is must. So abdominal wall sarcoma, out of truncal sarcoma, 10 to 20% will have a abdominal wall sarcoma. Most common presentation will be painless mass. However, one third patient will have pain. They might be associated with retinoblastoma, FAP, neurofibroma, lymphoma. Lymph node metastasis or oral metastasis is rare, 2 to 3%. Definitive diagnosis, biopsy with the core or incision biopsy. Core biopsy accuracy will be more than 90%. The definitive treatment, the 2 centimeter resection margin is needed, and radiation and chemotherapy response are usually low. Now, the abdominal wall metastasis, we all know they usually because of direct or hematogenous spread, and port side implantation risk has been seen with 0.9%, and the most common are lung, colon, melanoma. Now, coming to our next topic, peritoneum. So, the first question will be the root of mesentery is crossed by which of the following structure? So correct. The root of mesentery will be caused by horizontal part of duodenum. Correct. So the root of mesentery will be caused by our horizontal part of duodenum, then abdominal aorta, IVC, the right gonadal vessels. The ureter is not proper seen in this. The right ureter and the right psoas major. Now peritoneum. False statement. Answer is D. Stomata usually opens on the relaxation of the diaphragm. Rest of the statements are correct. So peritoneum usually is a 1 to 1.7 meter square surface area. They contain less than 100 ml of peritoneal fluid. They are usually bidirectional flow will be there, and they will facilitate migration of inflammatory cells. Microvilli will increase the surface area. Stomatas, they are intercellular pores on the interior surface of diaphragm. They will communicate with the lymphatic pools in the diaphragm, and in turn they will communicate with subpleural lymphatics. They will open on relaxation of the diaphragm, and this negative intrathoracic pressure will draws fluid and particle including bacteria into the thorax. Now SAG more than 1.1 is usually seen in B, correct, cirrhosis. So usually this causes which the diseases which cause portal hypertension will lead to the SAG level of more than 1.1. A patient came with ascites, sciatic fluid analysis showed SAG more than 1.1. All of the following can possible except
D, sir.
right. So answer is D, tuberculosis. So the cirrhosis, liver failure, metastasis, liver all can lead to SAG more than 1.1. No. SAG is usually the most reliable method to differentiate ascites due to portal hypertension and not due to portal hypertension. They have usually 97% accuracy, and it's a table taken from the submission. Cirrhosis, alcoholic hepatitis, even the cardiac failure, any fluid retention because of cardiac failure, massive liver metastasis, fulminant hepatic failure, portal vein thrombosis, mixed edema, all will come in the high gradient SAG ascites. While low will be our any carcinomatosis, tuberculosis, nephrotic syndrome, lymphatic leak, or any connective tissue disorders. Now, this is a table taken from the Bailey, which gives a low protein or high protein ascites. The only controversial thing what we need to remember is Bailey says Budd-Chiari syndrome is a exudate. It has a high protein ascites, while according to Sebastian, the Budd-Chiari syndrome will have a low protein ascites. So there's a difference between the Bailey and the Sebastian. So the most correct one is the Sebastian, but according to options, we have to decide what will be the answer. So ascites usually it's the most common complication of cirrhosis, and the most common cause of ascites is also cirrhosis. Flank dullness will be seen if the fluid amount is more than 1500 ml. And in the malignancy, there are multiple causes of ascites, whether it might be because of carcinomatosis or hepatic mets leading to portal hypertension or lymphatic blockage. And paracentesis indication usually any new onset ascites or any infection is there, or if a traumatic blood tinge tap is there, then it will clot. Non-traumatic blood tinge tap doesn't clot. Now, ascites in peritoneal mets. The false statement is sorry, it's wrongly written B. Its answer is A only, the light yellow color. The peritoneal mets will have a dark yellow color. So answer is A only. Now, the CHF usually have a light yellow color with a low specific gravity. Peritoneal mets will have a dark yellow color with a high specific gravity fluid. The color of peritoneal fluid will change with the leukocyte count also. Low leukocyte count will have a clear fluid. High leukocyte count will have a cloudy fluid. Lipids will give rise to the opalescent, cloudy to completely opaque type of fluid. And in case of if we refrigerate the this fluid for the 40 to 72 hours, the lipid will layer out from the rest of the fluid. Now, in case of uncomplicated cirrhotic ascites, the total count from 100 to 300 is usually considered normal. More than 250 is considered either because of inflammatory response, and the most common cause is spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Meigs syndrome, which is false statement. The answer is D. All are true statement only. So answer is D, none. Meigs syndrome is usually a solid fibroma of ovary, which also have ascites and pleural effusion, and usually effusion disappear if the tumor is excised. The another name just we need to remember is Levin and Denverson. They are now not used nowadays. They both are peritoneovenous shreds. Chylous ascites. The false statement is correct. The triglyceride level of the ascitic fluid should be high, and rest of the statement is true only. So the chylous ascites, the most common cause is neoplasm, and among neoplasm, the most common cause is lymphoma. Children, they are commonly follow-up cause of a blunt trauma or a penetrating trauma, or might be congenital only. Three main common causes might major mechanism either because of obstruction or a fistula or exudation of chyle to the walls of megalymphatics. So they usually present with the painless distension of the abdomen, and the 50% of patients will also have malnutrition dyspnea. SAG and triglyceride ascites we have already seen. So treatment we all know we have to give a low-fat diet, medium chain triglyceride diet with diuretics has to be given, and if patient is on fasting state we can give TPN with somatostatin. The patient who doesn't respond to normal operative management, you have to go with surgical exploration. So now a 15-year-old girl, regular swimmer, present with sudden onset of pain, distension, fever. The most probable diagnosis is. So answer will be ruptured typhoid ulcer. Usually untreated waters are more prone to develop salmonella infection. So while swimming, the patient is likely to develop uh, typhoid disease, and the more likely answer will be ruptured typhoid ulcer. Now, the bacterial peritonitis, the most common cause is perforation, and the bacteria commonly are seen in E. coli and bacteroides. Other one syndrome we need to remember is Valentino syndrome, mentioned in Bailey. Pain in right iliac fossa in case of peptic perforation has been termed as a Valentino syndrome. Non-GI among the non-GI cause of peritonitis, chlamydia and gonococci are the most common. They usually spread via fallopian tube. And in case of primary peritonitis, pneumococcal staph and strep. Regular sign is seen in correct. The regular sign will be seen in pneumoperitoneum. There are many named uh, signs for the pneumoperitoneum. We just need to remember the some names. So this regular sign is also known as double wall sign or the Bas release sign. They usually seen whenever there is a huge amount of pneumoperitoneum, more than 1000 ml. So, and other signs which have been just need to remember the name. You can go in detail with if you want to go in detail later. Telltale sign, the football sign, falciparum ligament sign, or inverted V sign, Eurectus sign, or the cupula sign, Molson Powell sign. So these are many name signs. You just need to remember the names of all the signs. Apart from E. coli, the other most common organism implicated in acute suppurative bacterial peritonitis is. Right, the answer is B. Klebsiella. So spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, E. coli and the Klebsiella pneumonia. These two are the most common bacteria. In children, nephrotic syndrome, the SORS and the S pneumonia are the more common. These patients usually have an in-hospital mortality of around 20%. Cirrhotic patient developing spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, they will survive only 20 to 30% for 2 years. Culture will be negative in around 60% of patients. Ascitic fluid will be usually low protein ascites. Neutrophil count will see more than 250 per mm cube. Antibiotic of choice is usually cefotaxime, a third generation cephalosporin. All are true about spontaneous bacterial peritonitis except correct. So the correct answer is B. Nutracetic ascites doesn't have a better prognosis. Basically, nutracetic ascites itself guide us towards its high likelihood of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, and the SBP has a very poor prognosis. Which of the following is true regarding classic spontaneous bacterial peritonitis?
A part.
Correct. It's a very simple, straightforward question. We just need to remember more than 250. Somewhere it might be 300. So the most correct answer is 250, but the next correct answer is 300. Now, the few points about tubercular peritonitis, the AFB staining will be seen only in less than 3% cases. Culture will be seen in only less than 20% cases. Both ultrasound and CT scan has a low sensitivity. Diagnosis, more than 90% of time will be able to identify whitish nodules which are less than 5 mm. And the most sensitive for diagnosis is laparoscopy with biopsy only. Now, the peritoneal dialysis associated peritonitis, the organism responsible for peritoneal associated peritonitis, the most common organism is epidermidis, and peritoneal dialysis usually have a cloudy appearance. Then leukocyte count will be more than 100, with neutrophil more than 50%. Gram staining will detect only 20 to 40% of cases. Intraperitoneal antibiotic is the treatment of choice, and the first generation cephalosporin should be given. Then later culture-directed therapy should be given, which will cure 75% of cases. All recurrent and persistent cases, we have to remove the catheter. Now the pneumococcal peritonitis, they will complicate usually nephrotic syndrome and the cirrhosis. They are usually seen in young girls, 3 to 9 years of age group. They will present with sudden lower abdominal pain and they have a profuse diarrhea. Leukocytosis will be seen with polymorph raised more than 90%. The peritoneal exudate will be odorless and sticky, which will give mostly characteristic of diagnosis of pneumococcal peritonitis. And early surgery is usually indicated unless spontaneous infection of pre-existing ascites. Now, another term we need to remember is familial Mediterranean fever. It's a periodic peritonitis which is usually present with sudden pain, tenderness, mild pyrexia, and duration will usually last for 24 to 72 hours, and which will be followed by complete remission. Occasionally will be associated with thoracic pain or joint pain, and in the regular interval they will recur. They are usually familial in nature, seen in Arab, Armenian, and Jewish population, and most patients had a history of appendectomy in their childhood. And gene usually associated gene is the MEFF gene, Mediterranean fever gene, which produces pyrin, and it is expressed mostly in neutrophils. Usually, they are seen in the children's and more commonly in the females. And in diagnostic laparoscopy, we'll see a inflamed peritoneum, especially in the vicinity of gallbladder and the spleen. And during the time of attacks, you have to give colchicine therapy. All are true about pseudomyxoma peritonei except. Correct. So they are more common in female according to Bailey, while according to Sebastian they are equally common in male and female. So pseudomyxoma peritonei, it's the accumulation of intraperitoneal mucin. They might be from benign to malignant. They have a very variable presentation. They are usually large located cystic masses, and they have a yellow jelly type of fluids inside the peritoneum. They will be non-shifting fluid, and there will be no extraperitoneal mass. Initially, they are usually asymptomatic. And the most common primary we need to remember is the appendix. And CT scan will detect the extent. Colonoscopy should be done to differentiate neoplasm of appendix and colon. And often during laparoscopy only diagnosis has been made. The majority is due to result of perforation of mucinous appendicular tumor. And without intervention, they are usually fatal. And appendix, after the removal of appendix with epithelial tumor removal, there is a risk of 9% of development of pseudomyxoma peritonitis. Non-luminous neoplasm removal, then there is a chance of 3% risk of development of pseudomyxoma peritonitis. While mucinous adenocarcinoma removal of appendix, there is a risk of 30 to 50% of development of pseudomyxoma peritonitis. Now, they can be of variable grade from acellular mucin to low grade carcinoma peritonitis to high grade carcinoma peritonitis with signatory. So, usually treatment is cytoreduction plus uh, intraperitoneal heated chemotherapy with mitomycin C. Cytoreduction should include omentectomy with stripping of involved peritoneum, dissection of involved organ, and appendectomy with right hemicolectomy. And no nodules should be left which is more than 2 mm size. Now, a technique which is mentioned by Bailey is Sugar-Baker technique for pseudomyxoma peritonitis. According to this technique, you have to remove right hemicolon, screen, GB, omentum, uterus, ovarian omen, and stripping of peritoneum with all the nodules. Now, if you achieve the complete shadow reduction, there is survival of 5 to 10 years is around 87 and 70%. While the poor outcome is seen in male patients who have an increased tumor marker or high grade and invasive features. In experience center, operative mortality is only 2% and morbidity is around 15%. Complete shadow reduction has been seen to be achieved in 75% of the patients, and the most common post-op complication is bowel ileus. True about mesenteric cystis. Correct. The lymphatic cyst has a separate blood supply. Now, the mesenteric cyst usually seen in female patient, and the mean age is usually 45 to 50 years of age group. One third patient might be present in the younger age group, less than 15. In children, the mean age is usually 4.5 years. And the mesothelial cyst, this is the most common non-neoplastic mesenteric cyst. The more commonly they are seen in small bowel, but they can also be seen in colon. And the investigation of choice is CT scan. 3% of the patient of mesenteric cyst will have a malignancy, mostly sarcomatous type. So they usually present with a painless abdominal mass with Tilloch sign, that is a cyst moving perpendicular to the direction of mesentery. The most common mesenteric cyst is right. One line which has been mentioned is mesothelial cyst. It's a most common non-neoplastic mesenteric cyst. They mentioned in Sebastian one line, but whenever it is asked which is the most common type of mesenteric cyst, the answer will be chylomymphatic cyst only. Now, the this mass usually have a fluctuation near umbilicus, and the zone of resonance will be seen around the cyst. They will might present with recurrent pain, abdomen, and vomiting because of voice is breaking. It seems everyone can hear me. Okay, fine. So, in case of bolus impaction or torsion or rupture or hemorrhage, they may present with recurrent pain, abdomen, with vomiting. Now, the most common type of mesenteric cyst we have already seen. It's a chylomymphatic cyst only. So the two type of mesenteric cyst which we can see is chylomymphatic cyst and the endogenous cyst. The more common will be chylomymphatic cyst, which is a misplaced lymphatic tissue in the peritoneum in the mesentery. And endogenous cyst is usually a duplication or diverticulum of a bowel. So chylomymphatic cysts usually have a thin wall, while endogenous cysts will have a thick wall. The flat endothelium will be seen in chylomymphatic cyst, while a mucous membrane is seen in endogenous cyst because it's a the duplication or diverticulum of bowel. Clear lymph or chyle will be seen in chylomymphatic, while mucinous or yellow-brown color will be seen in endogenous. We all know the chylomymphatic will have an independent blood supply, so they can be enucleated, and endogenous will have a common blood supply, so they have to be resected. Now, Billy says bowel resection, around one third of adults will need a bowel resection for mesenteric cyst, while only 50 to 60% of children, among half of the children will need bowel resection for mesenteric cyst, and the recurrence rate is around 0 to 13%. Internal drainage can be done only for a very large cyst. Aspiration is usually not recommended, which have a very high recurrence rate. If marsupialization has been done, then lining should be sclerosed with 10% glucose or diethylene or benzodiazepine. Now, among the mesenteric tumors, the most common malignant neoplasm, there is a controversy whether answer is metastasis or lymphoma. This most common malignant neoplasm, according to SWOT, they have written it's a lymphoma, but submission says the most. Okay, some background disturbance is there, wait, I'll check. Okay, so the answer most common malignant neoplasm of mesentery, I think the most common answer should be metastasis first. Then if the metastasis is not an option, then we should go for lymphoma. Acute mesenteric lymphadenitis is caused by, correct, the Yersinia, we all know. So acute mesenteric lymphadenitis, usually it has either unknown etiology or they may be associated with Yersinia. They are more commonly in TB. They're seen in younger adults with the equally predisposition to male and female. And preceding respiratory infection has been seen in 25% of the cases. High temperature will be seen in more than half cases. They have a usually high recurrence. They present with central pain and vomiting. If they have tenderness, it will be very poorly localized. Since it's because of lymphadenopathy, there will be shifting tenderness will be there. Leukocytosis, which will be usually fall on day 2. The commonest cause of acute mesenteric adenitis is so Yersinia is not there is option. Even if the Yersinia is in the option, the answer should be idiopathic only first. Most common primary malignant peritoneal tumor is correct. The answer is mesothelioma. The most common primary malignant tumor is mesothelioma, and they are usually due to asbestos exposure. They mostly present with abdominal pain and weight loss, and they are usually confined to abdomen only, not metastasizing to anywhere else. So on CT scan, there will be mesenteric thickening with the hemorrhage within the tumor can be seen along with peritoneal seeding. Local invasion can occur. The mesothelioma of pleural cavity is more common than peritoneal cavity, and the malignant peritoneal mesothelioma has a more chances of predilection of pelvic peritoneum. Treatment is same as the carcinomatosis, the surgery plus IHP. Sclerosing mesenteritis, true statement. Correct. So all are true statement. They have a tumor pseudocapsule. They may resolve spontaneously and the abdominal mass will palpable. So exploring mesenteritis most commonly in the root of mesentery, and they are usually seen in the fifth decade. And initially they have a loose myxomatous appearance, and slowly they will progress to dense sclerosis. Mostly asymptomatic, but symptom may present because of intestinal obstruction or other organ involvement. Mass will be palpable in more than half of the cases. There are two signs, you just need to remember the name. The tumor pseudocapsule will be seen and the fat ring sign will be seen in CT scan. Other than that, there will be normal mesenteric vessel coursing through the fatty mass without evidence of any vascular involvement. So in sclerosing mesenteritis, there won't be any vascular involvement. And the bowel invasion will also be not there. Now, for the definitive diagnosis, biopsies must, CT scan alone will not be sufficient. So either laparotomy or laparoscopic guided biopsy has to be done to diagnose the sclerosing mesenteritis. So on the biopsy, there will be marked, we can see the marked thickening of mesentery, irregular area of discoloration which will suggest fat necrosis, multiple discrete nodules or single matted mass can be seen, and micro microscopic appearance will reveal fat necrosis, lipid-laden macrophage, chronic inflammation, or focal calcification. So most of the cases will resolve spontaneously, and those who are not resolved, we have to give corticosteroid and anti-inflammatory. The mesocolic hernia, which is the true statement. Sorry, the it's not true statement. We have to give false statement here. The three statements are true, only one is false. So the false statement is A. More common is on the left side. Right side treatment is incision of lateral peritoneal reflection, and the whole of the small bowel will come to the right side. And right mesocolic hernia, SMA usually from the middle border of the neck. IMV and IMA are usually integral component of hernia sac in the left side. So this is the right-sided mesocolic hernia and the left-sided mesocolic hernia. Now, the right mesocolic hernia, whenever the prearterial limb of midcuff loop fails to rotate, so most of the small intestine will remain to the right of the supramesentery and they will be trapped behind the right colon. They all will be trapped behind the mesentery of right colon, and most of the small bowel will be located to the right of the supramesenteric artery. And the wall of the sac, this entire wall of the sac, they will have most of the branches of artery. The ileocolic, right colic, middle colic, they will belong with the entire wall of the sac. While SMA will form the medial border of the neck of the hernia. A left mesocolic hernia, it's most common. It is because of in utero herniation of small intestine between inframesenteric vein and posterior parietal attachment of descending mesocolon. So the inferior mesenteric vein and the posterior parietal attachment, whenever the intestine will go for herniation in utero period, this will develop the left mesocolic hernia. So in this case, both IMV and IMA will be seen in the hernia sac only. They will be integral component of the hernia sac. Now, for the treatment of right mesocolic hernia, the incision of lateral parietal reflection along the right colon should be done. So, what will happen? The gut will assume a non-rotation position, and the whole of the small ball will come to the right side, and the large ball will come to the left side. But important thing we need to remember: we are not supposed to open the neck of the hernia because it will injure the supramesenteric vessel. While for left mesocolic hernia, we have to incise parietal attachment and adhesion along the right side of the inferior mesenteric vein. So this is the inferior mesenteric vein. We have to incise this parietal fold here. We have to incise this parietal fold. In this case, the IMB will allow come to its normal position. In neck of the hernia, after that may be closed by switching the peritoneum adjacent to the vein to the retroperitoneum. Ormond's disease is correct. Idiopathic retroperitoneal fibrosis is hormone disease. So retroperitoneal fibrosis, most of the cases are idiopathic only and they are called hormone disease. 30% cases may be associated with some drugs or other etiologies like infection, trauma, hemorrhage, surgery. Bailey mentions other diseases like urinary extravasation, aortic aneurysm, lymphoma, carcinoma, and secondary deposits. They might be associated with IgG4, and HLA association has been seen with HLA DRB103. Most common organ involvement in retroperitoneal fibrosis is correct. The ureter is the answer. The ureter usually will be involved in 80 to 90% of the cases, and their retroperitoneal fibrosis are usually confined to central and perivertebral space. 15% of cases they may extend outside to the periduodenal pelvic mediastinum, more commonly in male elderly patients. Now, idiopathic cases has been seen associated with inflammatory aortic aneurysm or autoimmune disorders. Other association can also be seen as Hashimoto's, Cushing, Dupuytren, or Peyronie's disease. So they usually have a local symptom. There might be extremity edema, scrotal swelling, or limb edema can be there. Obstructive uropathy can be seen. CT scan will demonstrate homogeneous and isodense to muscle. The tumor which is isodense to muscle surrounds the aorta. T2 will give a high intensity, and in quiescent and mature stage, there will be low intensity in both T1 and T2. So for the treatment, goal is to stop progression, relieve any ureteral obstruction is there, inhibit systematic inflammatory response. The corticosteroid is the mainstay of treatment. Other treatment can be given like tamoxifen and immunosuppressant. Operative treatment only if there is a ureteral obstruction is there, so ureteric stenting or open ureterolysis can be done. Repair of aneurysm if aneurysm is more than 4.5 centimeters. So patient who respond to corticosteroid will have a 90% 5-year survival. Malignant change in lipoma is most commonly seen in which type of lipoma? Correct. The retroperitoneal lipoma will have more chances of myxomatous degeneration. So retroblading lipoma more commonly in females. Sometimes they reach immense size and they may undergo myxomatous degeneration. So they often are malignant liposarcoma, though, so they have to be removed. So very few points of retroblading sarcoma. They are usually 1 to 2% of all solid malignancies. 10 to 20% of all sarcomas of are retroperitoneal only. They are usually seen in fifth decade. The three most commonly seen are liposarcoma, leiomyosarcoma, and malignant fibrous histiocytoma. Commonest site of intraperitoneal abscess is correct. The pelvis is the most common site of intraperitoneal abscess. Most pathognomic in pelvic abscess is loose stool is not most pathognomic. Most pathognomic is mucopurulent discharge. Mucus discharge is the most pathognomic for the pelvic abscess. So the most common site of abscess in the peritoneum is pelvic abscess only. They commonly present with pelvic pain, diarrhea, and the mucus stool. And diarrhea will give anterectal wall bulge. Treatment of pouch of Douglas abscess is at the posterior colpotomy. So drainage should be either done via the vaginal route or via the rectal drainage. So vaginal drainage is through posterior fornix, the posterior colpotomy, and some patient may also itself burst into the rectum only. Most common cause of infection and collection of fluid in left subhepatic space is correct. The answer is B. Complicated acute pancreatitis is the most common cause of left subhepatic abscess. So the left subphrenic and the left subhepatic abscess, the boundaries are not very important. The left subphrenic boundaries we all know, we don't need to go in detail. The only important thing here is the most common cause of left subhepatic or left subhepatic abscess is the complicated acute pancreatitis. Sometimes posteriorly perforating ulcer can also give rise to the left subhepatic space abscess. The part of peritoneal cavity that is most dependent in supine position is the right subhepatic space is the most dependent. So there are two spaces, right subphrenic and the right subhepatic. Similarly, the boundaries we all know, we don't need to go in the detail of the boundary. And most common of all subphrenic abscess, the right subhepatic is the most deepest of all, and most common of all abscess is the of all subphrenic is the right subhepatic only. The causes we all know, all of the causes of nearby structures perforation. Especially we need to remember is appendicitis is the cause in both the for right subphrenic also, right subhepatic also. Most common neoplasm of mesentery is correct. The answer is metastasis. If the metastasis is not in the option, you can go with lymphoma. So a few important points: the acquired internal hernia in lap colectomy it is 1%, and lap RYGB is around 9%. Most common neoplasm mesentery metastasis. Most common primary neoplasm of the mesentery desmoid tumor. Most common cause of mesenteric injury is torsion force, that is seatbelt injury. Now the omental involvement most commonly seen in which tumor? The answer is B. Ovarian carcinoma. The omental involvement most commonly seen in ovarian carcinoma, and primary omental neoplasm is very rare. Extragastrointestinal stromal tumor is the most rare malignant tumor. It is there. Now the omental infarction, it can be primary or secondary. Primary directly torsion, vasculitis, or thrombosis. More commonly, they are secondary because of hernia, tumor, or adhesion. They are most commonly seen in obese male patients, and ultrasound will give a hyperechoic, non-compressible mass. and CT scan will give us streaking whirling pattern of fatty tissue. Now coming to hernia, we'll proceed fast in the hernia because you all know hernia in detail very well. So there won't be much MCQs here. We'll proceed the basic points and listen. So these are the few points from the Bailey. The only natural weakness is the lumbar triangle and the posterior wall of the inguinal canal. Development failure of posterior vaginalis to close. They have given two genes, calcitonin gene-related peptide and the haplocyte growth factor. And perfect wound healing, only 70% of the initial muscle strength can be gained. Now, inguinal hernia will be more common in wider and shorter pelvis. And the most important point is recent Swedish report, which has been mentioned in both Swords and the Bailey, that the inguinal hernia is less common in obese patients. It's talking about only inguinal hernia, not other ventral hernias. Only inguinal hernia has been seen less common in obese patients. Now, these are the few risk factors. We don't need to go in detail of these risk factors. If you connective tissue disorders associated with the hernia. Now, the most common type of hernia in female is, it's a very simple question. Correct. The indirect inguinal hernia is the most common in both male and female. So all the abdominal wall hernia, most common is inguinal hernia only. And for both male and female, indirect inguinal hernia is the most common. And both indirect inguinal hernia, femoral inguinal hernia is more common on the right side. Now, why they are common on the right side? Because of slow descent of right testis, delay atrophy of processus vaginalis, and tamponading effect of sigmoid on left side. Now, all the groin hernias, they are more common in male only, 25 times more common in male. Strangulation, 1 to 3% of groin hernias are strangulation and mostly they are indirect. Highest rate of strangulation has been seen in femoral hernia, around 15 to 20%. Preferred investigation for incisional hernia is correct. The answer is CT scan. So this is a chart mentioned in the Bailey. Ultrasound scan is only covered, but for incisional hernia, CT scan should be done. MRI is good for sportsman groin with pain. Now, the deep inguinal ring, we all know the anatomy of deep inguinal ring. The inferior crust will be formed by iliopubic tract. Superior crust will be formed by our transverse abdominis muscle arch. Lateral border will be connected to transverse abdominis, which form a Sutter mechanism. Now, the another thing we is a pectineal ligament. So the pectineal ligament, it's a posterior border of femoral canal. Okay. This is the pectineal ligament. It forms the posterior border of femoral canal. This is the full femoral sheath. This is the femoral canal compartment. The pectoral forms the posterior border. And the 75% it will be caused by a vessel at the lateral border, which is a branch of obstetrical artery. Now, the inguinal canal boundaries, we all know very in detail. The posterior wall, which will be formed by transverse fascia and conjoint tendon, anterior wall, roof. So we don't need to go in detail of the walls, and the floor we also know. Now, the content, the inguinal canal content. Right, so all of the other content of. So we just need to know three arteries, three facial layers, three other structures, and the three nerves. Three arteries are artery to vas deferens, testicular artery, and the cremasteric artery. Three facial layers are external spermatic fascia, internal spermatic fascia, and the cremasteric fascia. Three other structures will be femtiform plexus, vas deferens, and testicular lymphatics. The more commonly which we'll forget are the three nerves: the genital branch of genital femoral nerve, sympathetic and visceral efferent nerve, and ilioinguinal nerve. Hazelbeck triangle is bounded by following except okay. The Hazelbeck triangle will be bounded by rectus abdominis, inferior gastric, and the inguinal ligament. So these are the three main boundaries of the Hazelbeck triangle. Now type 3A Nyhus classification of hernia. So answer will be direct inguinal hernia. So type 1 will be indirect inguinal hernia with normal internal ring. Type 2 internal inguinal hernia with enlarged internal ring. Type 3 will be A will be direct hernia. 3B is pantaloon hernia, that is direct plus indirect hernia. 3C is femoral hernia. 4 will A will be direct recurrent inguinal hernia. 4B is indirect recurrent hernia. 4C is recurrent femoral hernia. 4D is combination of 4A and 4B. Type 7 Gilbert hernia is okay. The type 10 Gilbert hernia is femoral hernia. So Gilbert classification initially it was only has the five types: type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So type 1, 2, and 3 they will have a internal ring dilated, that is less than one finger breadth dilated, and more than one finger breadth. So internal ring dilated. These are the indirect inguinal hernia. Type 1, 2, 3. Then they all will have peritoneal sac. Type 4 and 5 are usually considered direct hernias. They are the direct hernias. Only because the canal floor is disrupted. Only thing which we need to remember is type 3, since the internal inguinal ring is very much dilated, so it will also lead to encroachment of posterior canal floor, and the posterior canal floor will also be disrupted in type 3 of Gilbert classification. Now the Rutko and Robbins, they added type 6 and type 7. Type 6 they've added as a double inguinal hernia, that's a pantaloon hernia. Type 7 as a femoral hernia. Now there's another classification by European Hernia Society. They simplified the primary recurrent PNR, lateral for indirect, medial for direct, and femoral LMF. And defect size will be measured in finger breadth, which is assumed to be 1.5 centimeters. So duodenal funicular complete, we all know. The direct inguinal hernia, usually they have a 12% contralateral hernia also, and the fourfold chances of developing contralateral hernia in future. They will have meldingmic bulge also, and they may also be seen after hypogastric nerve damage during appendectomy. Now the few repairs, the named repair we all know, that is Bethany, Halstead, McFay, Soldy's repair, which has a lifetime failure rate of 2%, Darning, which is also called the Melanie, and the recent repair which has been added is the DSADA repair, which uses the external oblique aponeurosis for the repair of posterior nerve. The tension-free repair, which has a Lichtenstein repair, or the patch and plug repair, which can also lead to high mesodermal formation, or they may migrate also. Now, these are the technique which is being mentioned in all the books nowadays. They take a leaf of external oblique aponeurosis and use for the repair of posterior wall. Now, coming to the preparietal repair, it was the first described by Annandale in 1880. Preparietal repair means they will place a mesh in the preparietal plane. Now, later in 1950, by the Stopa, French surgeon, which will describe this repair with the mesh reconstruction. 5% of all inguinal hernia repair will be done by the emergency, and in laparoscopic hernia repair, we'll place a 10 to 15 centimeter mesh. They should be placed 5 centimeter lateral to deep inguinal ring up, and mesh should cover Hazelbeck triangle, deep inguinal ring, and the femoral canal. Which of the following is correct regarding the boundaries of triangle of Doom? So the answer is A. The triangle of Doom boundary will be C. The triangle of Doom, which is medial border, is the ductus deferens. The lateral border is gonadal vessels, and the posterior border is peritoneal edge, and the content will be usually our iliac vessels and also genital glands or genitourinary. Now, the other is triangle of pain. The triangle of pain usually formed by a uh, supramiddle border is by gonadal vessel, lateral border by the refracted peritoneum, and the infralateral border by the iliopubic tract. Now, the another theme we need to remember is corona mortis. The corona mortis, which is the circle of death, it is usually because of connection between the external iliac artery and the internal iliac branches. So, inferior epigastric artery, which is a branch of external iliac artery, and obturator artery, which is a branch of internal iliac artery, they will have a connection, which will be by a aberrant obturator artery. So, this will form a circle of death, and this artery usually runs near the pectineal ligament. Now, after repair, the 50% recurrence which if occur, they will occur in within 3 years. Soldiers have more chance of recurrence than mesh repair, and bilateral repairs have a similar incidence of recurrence than unilateral repair. So both the hernia can be repaired simultaneously. Direct repair have a more chance of recurrence. Relaxing incision, if there is a tension repair, then relaxing incision will decrease the recurrence risk. Femoral hernia is have a risk of 2%, but repair after recurrence will have a chance of 10% recurrence. Now, the complications, surgical site infection usually occur in 1 to 2% of the cases. So that's why pre-op antibiotics should be given in all the ASF equals to more than 3, that is cefazolin or clindamycin. Other complication, that is nerve injury or chronic pain. The chronic pain, which is defined by the pain which is more than 3 months. So 10% of patient will have a chronic pain, and is the most common complication after mesh hernia repair, as mentioned by Bailey. And the best treatment is usually repeated exposition and neurectomy and mesh removal. Ischemic aortic study is simple. Then there is a plexus thrombus. They will be swollen and tender. Testis will be there for 2 to 5 days. It will continue to 6 to 12 weeks. And rarely they will need orchiectomy, and commonly they will be seen after recurrent hernia surgery. Now this is a complication list after the open laparoscopic repairs. So only thing what we to remember is complication more in lap will be usually seroma, neuralgia, orchitis, recurrent infection, while more in open is chronic pain and long-term orchitis. A few points regarding strangulated hernia. The most common constriction we all know is the neck of sac. The most common content in strangulated hernia is usually small intestine. And infancy usually have a 4% incidence of strangulation and hernia, and they are more common in female. The strangulated inguinal hernia more common in female in infancy. Now the most common content in hernia and glisted is the answer is sigmoid colon. The most common content is sigmoid colon, but if the right side they ask it's a sigmoid, right side they ask it's a cecum. They are usually for the content in the posterior wall of the sac of the viscus, more commonly on the left side. So usually sliding hernia start as a retroperitoneal fatty tissue which is pushed down along the inguinal canal. So as the more tissue enters, the hernia peritoneum will be pulled with it. So the sac which is formed secondarily, it will be classically distributed from an indirect hernia. Now, the femoral hernia is characteristically thin. Okay. So it will be seen usually in the lateral and the below the pubic tubercle. So femoral hernia usually more common in female, the low weight elderly females, and the 50% of the cases will present in emergency. They have a 15 times high chance after inguinal hernia repair, and 10% of femoral hernia women will develop inguinal hernia also, and 15% of femoral hernia men patient will develop inguinal hernia in the future. They are more common on the right side, and 20% chance of bilaterality. They usually are the below and lateral to pubic tubercle. They lie in the upper leg and may only be only 1 to 2 centimeter and may be mistaken for lymph node. But as soon as the size increase, they will go superiorly, and that time it will be difficult to distinguish from medial direct hernia. This structure lies immediately lateral to femoral hernia.
C, sir.
Answer will be femoral vein. So the femoral vein will be lies immediately lateral to the femoral hernia. So femoral hernia will come from this canal from here. So answer will be femoral vein. So this is a femoral sheath which will contain our femoral canal, femoral vein, artery, and the nerve. Now this is again another representation. Treatment of femoral hernia, Lockwood operation refers to
B, sir. High angle.
Lockwood will be low inguinal. So low inguinal is Lockwood, high inguinal is McEvedy, and the inguinal approach is Lockwood. Only the name are important. So low for Lockwood. Now this is another classification system for primary ventral hernia which is mentioned in Shackelford. Not very important, just for the size. Small will be less than 2 centimeters, medium 2 to 4, large will be more than 4. Spegelian hernia is a type of hernia occurring at okay. So they will be usually occurring at the lateral border of the rectus abdominis. Spegelian hernia is a defect within the following muscles. So
C,
answer will be C, transverse abdominis muscle. So the Spegelian hernia usually they come from Spegelian fascia. The Spegelian fascia will be at the lateral border of rectus abdominis muscle. So this Bailey also says it is formed by a aponeurosis of transverse abdominis muscle. While Thomas Sebastian says the Spegelian fascia is a aponeurosis between rectus muscle and the linea semularis. This fascia is between the rectus muscle and the linea semularis. So the answer will be transverse abdominis for the last question. So this is the hernia which will come from this is rectus muscle, here is the transverse abdominis, and the interoblique. The hernia will come, it's intraparietal, it will not cross the external oblique aponeurosis. So usually they are located at or below the umbilicus, and they are almost always interparietal in nature. They have a small 1 to 2 centimeters and equal predisposition for male and female. If they have a narrow neck, and chances of strangulation will be high, around 20 to 30% emergency surgery. And the CT scan will confirm the diagnosis, but USG have advantage of performing in standing position. So mostly they are young patients with having extraparietal fat only. If they are elderly patient, they may have a sac along with the hernia. So most are below the umbilicus at the edge of the rectus sheath along according to Bailey, and they are almost always above the arcuate line. This is the statement from the Bailey. So 50% of patients have a history of laparotomy, and the initial complaint will be pain most of the time, and more than half cases will be diagnosed intraoperatively only. 20 to 30% will require emergency intervention we have seen. So treatment usually needed transverse incision, and defect should be closed transversely only. Large defect mesh placement will be needed, and recurrence is usually uncommon in Spegelian hernia. False statement about lumbar hernia. Answer is D. So superior will be our Greenfield triangle, inferior will be our Pettit triangle. The boundary we all know, superior will be 12th rib, then our internal oblique muscle and the quadratus lumborum muscle. Inferior will have a iliac crest on one side, external oblique, and latissimus dorsi on one side. So both the triangle will have a bony margin, while the iliac crest will have an inferiorly bony margin, while the superior triangle will have a superiorly bony margin. And this both bony margin will be used for the repair of hernia. The mesh will be fixed to this bony margin on both the sides. For superior triangle, the 12th dorsal intercostal universal bundle will penetrate this fascia, the transverse abdominal fascia, while in inferior triangle, the floor will be formed by lumbodorsal fascia and the transverse muscle. Lumbar hernia, which is more commonly seen on the left side, mostly in the elderly male patient, they are superior lumbar hernia is more common, and if the traumatic hernia is there, then they are more likely chance to be of having infralumbar hernia. They are not prone to strangulation, but still some cases present with strangulation. They can be of two types, congenital or acquired. 10 to 20% patient can have a congenital lumbar hernia. They are usually associated with lumboscostovertebral syndrome or other syndromes like congenital diaphragmatic hernia or ASD. Acquired, they can be primary or secondary, and primary will be 55% of all acquired hernia. Secondary will be because of some surgery, some non-incision. The CT scan is the preferred diagnostic modality, and 10 to 80% have evidence of strangulation, and 25% will have incapsulated wall. This is a statement from Shackelford. While Sebastian says there is a very less likelihood of strangulation in lumbar hernia. So DD lipoma coalescence we all know. Another thing is pseudo hernia, that is local muscle paralysis, and is the most common cause is subcostal nerve damage in kidney operation. The treatment is usually transabdominal prepartum repair in semilateral position, and if large hernia is there, then muscle flap double dressing with metal reinforcement should be. Now, the umbilical hernia in children, they are usually seen in infant age group. They will spontaneously close by 2 years. 95% will spontaneously close, and there are more 8 times high chances in African American patients. And repair should be done if they are persisting more than 5 years. In adults, they are usually more common in female patients, and defect usually immediately adjacent to the or most often above the two umbilicus. Strangulation is usually unusual, and they um, have a high risk of umbilical hernia in adult if they have a midline single decussation. Small defect can be primary repair, more than 3 centimeter, mesh repair should be done. Marrow repair nowadays not done because it has a high recurrence risk. Hernia which often stimulate a peptic ulcer is. Okay. The answer will be fatty hernia of linea alba, that is epigastric hernia, which will be many times mistaken for a peptic ulcer disease. So epigastric hernia more common in the male, in the young age group, the most important, and they will be usually present in 5 to 6 centimeter within umbilicus. 20% of time they will be multiple, and 80% of time they will be midline, but rest of the time they can be paramedian also. So the patient will be usually young patient with the pain out of proportion, and they might have some small tender lump in the epigastric region. They will be tender on palpation, and defect is usually elliptical amount elliptical of about 1 centimeter in the diameter, and they resemble the shape of mushroom, and they may be mistaken for a lipoma. So very small epigastric hernia, they are known to disappear spontaneously. Small to moderate, offered surgery is only offered if the hernia is sufficiently symptomatic. Treatment, all epigastric hernia are better repaired anteriorly because the defect is usually hidden behind the falciform. So if we are going for the lap repair, first we have to take down the falciform, see the defect and repair it. Most common cause of recurrence according to Bailey is failure to identify the second defect in epigastric hernia. Now coming to the obturator hernia. Obturator hernia more commonly seen in female elderly patients. And the obturator canal, which will be formed by union of pubic and ischium, will be covered by a obturator membrane. And usually swelling will be appear in the Scarpa's triangle, and the more apparent when the limb is flexion erected. Now, this hernia usually superiorly they will be bound by superior pubic rami, inferiorly by body and inferior ramus of the bone, and interiorly, and inferiorly will be ramus and body of ischium. Now, the most common path for obturator hernia is to the external opening of the canal along the anterior division of obturator nerve, and sac will lie behind the pectineus muscle. Alternate path can be they can come between the upper and middle fascicular obturator muscle. They will come along the posterior division of obturator nerve. So this will diagram will make it more clear. The hernia can come from the with the anterior division, or the hernia may come from with the posterior division of the nerve. So the anterior division, the hernia which is coming from the anterior division of the nerve, they will be lie behind the pectineus muscle. This one. Now they are mostly overlooked because of the covering fattiness, and they are usually seen in the women with wider pelvis, having constipation and malnutrition with high intraabdominal pressure. CT scan will have a 90% accuracy of diagnosis. The Huntington Keefe sign is seen in the Huntington Keefe sign is usually seen in obstetrical hernia only. The two signs we need to remember is the Horship-Romberg sign, which is seen in only 15 to 50% cases, and Huntington Keefe sign. So the Horship-Romberg sign, that is pain in anteromedial aspect of thigh, which is elicited by extension of thigh, which will relieve on flexion of thigh. Huntington Keefe sign, which is that is absent adductor reflex. So 50% of the obstetrical hernia will have a complete or partial obstruction, and more than 50% will have a strangulation, and frequently have a Richards type of hernia. Pain is referred to knee in obstetrical hernia because of a geniculate branch of obstetrical nerve. The repair usually done in full Trendelenburg position. You have to give incision parallel to obstetrical nerve and vessel. Defect usually closed with mesh plug. Broad ligament or uterus, other thing can be used as a plug. Glue is usually fixed to avoid injury to nerve. Now coming to the sciatic hernia. Sciatic hernia, they have three potential space. The two spaces, that is greater sciatic foramen and the lesser sciatic foramen. Greater vein is again divided into two parts because of piriformis. So the sciatic hernia usually seen in female patients. They have acute and chronic pain in the thigh, and they are frequently asymptomatic also. And CT scan is preferred to have for diagnosis. Then they will present as a slow enlarging mass in gluteal region. So these are the spaces: suprapiriformis space, infrapiriformic space, and the lesser sciatic foramen. So these are the three potential space for sciatic hernia. Now the Bailey mentioned the gluteal hernia and sciatic hernia as a separate entity, while Shackelford mentioned all these three spaces as a sciatic hernia only. But Bailey says all the hernia coming from greater sciatic foramen will be called as a gluteal hernia, and they can be coming from either above and below piriformis. So these are the gluteal hernia, while sciatic hernia is only from lesser sciatic foramen. Another entity is a ureteric sciatic hernia that will have a sciatic hernia which have an involvement of ureter or kidney or bladder along with the hernia. So in those cases, there will be pathognomic curly Q ureter will be seen in excretory ureterogram. Now for the repair, transpetal approach will be preferred. Transgluteal approach in case of sciatic hernia done only if there is a certain diagnosis, hernia is reducible and no intestinal obstruction. But it has a high risk of neurovascular injury, and muscle splitting incision is usually given to the gluteus maximus. Now for the transgluteal approach, patient will be placed in prone position. Incision will be given from posterior edge of gluteal trochanter across the hernia. Gluteus maximus will be open and the hernia will be reduced. Muscle edge will be reapproximated with interproximated. The sportsman groin is not a very important topic. Usually the athletic patients or young men, they'll present with severe pain in the groin area extending to scrotum. They usually have a no hernia on examination, and the most cases are due to orthopedic injury. Now coming to the perineal hernia. Perineal hernia, they are very uncommon hernias, and very few cases are reported. They may occur after any perineal surgeries, either APR or prostatectomy. And primary perineal hernia is very rare. They are usually present with swelling in labia majora, mostly multiparous female, and can be quite large. So Shackelford says the perineal hernia can be either congenital or acquired. Acquired can be of either primary variety or secondary variety. Primary is very rare, we have already seen. Secondary is usually after a pelvic surgery. So based upon the location, it can also be classified as anterior or posterior. Anterior is extremely rare and seen only in female. They are defect in urogenital diaphragm lateral to vaginal vestibule. Posteriorly, they can either come through the levator ani or space between levator and coccygeus. They are mostly secondary and they are still more common in female only. And the posterior type is most common. So these are the three potential spaces for perineal hernias. So this is that superficial transverse perineal muscle. So anterior to this will be anterior perineal hernia, and posterior to this will be posterior perineal hernia. So these two are the potential space for posterior perineal hernia. So this is coming through the levator ani. This is between the levator ani and the coccygeus muscle. So this anterior perineal hernia usually bounded by the three muscles: ischio-cavernous laterally, bulbospongius medially, and the superficial transverse perineal posteriorly. Now, the Bailey mentioned the most perineal hernia is because of post-op hernia scar, yeah, and they can be of three varieties: medial sliding perineal hernia, that is complete rectal prolapse, or anterolateral hernia, or posterolateral hernia, which can be coming through the levator ani, as which enters the iliacorectal fossa. The treatment is usually either transabdominal approach, perineal approach only if there is a small straightforward case, but it has a very high recurrence. Ideal is combined transabdominal perineal approach, and nowadays lap mesh hernia repair is gaining the trend. 50% of laparotomies will develop incision hernia. They often have multiple defects, and obstruction is quite common, but strangulation is less frequent in incision hernia. So Shackelford says it can be of three types: either acute wound dehiscence, subacute because of early gaping, and the chronic, that will be Suez or cheese cutting. Then they have also given data after cells and robotic, there is a 3% chance of developing incision hernia. Other data, that is midline laparotomy, will have a 10.5% risk. Transverse incision will have a 7.5%. Paramedian has a 2.5%. All the risk will double if there was a surgical site infection. Now there is a ventral hernia working group classification for predicting any incision hernia. So they have classified it into grade 1, 2, 3, 4. So grade 1 usually has a low risk, that is no history of wound infection is there. Grade 2, all comorbid are included in grade 2. If there's a contaminated field is there, then it will be considered as a grade 3. Infected field is there, then it will be considered as a grade 4. The modified version and the grade 3 and grade 4 usually require a biologic mesh. Now later it has been modified and it has been given 3 grade 1, 2, 3. So the last infected one is removed. The surgical side occurrence risk in grade 1 is 14%, grade 2 is 27%, and grade 3 is 46%. Now another ventral hernia risk score system is there. They have taken 5 criteria, that is concomitant hernia repairs, skin flap, ASA more than 3, BMI more than 50, class 4 dirty wound. According to that, they have created 5 groups among the points. The more the points, the more chances of future hernia. Now this is the staging system given in submission. The stage 1, that is less than 10 cm clean wound. Stage 2, less than 10 with contamination, or 10 to 20 with clean wound. Stage 3 is more than 10 cm or with contamination, or any wound which is more than 20 cm. Now there are the various risk factors for incision hernia. We don't need to go in detail. Only you need to remember 60 gram of ethanol per day is a risk factor. And usually BMI less than 40 is considered safe for repair, but ideal is 30. Now there is another classification for incision hernia given by European Hernia Society. So they are according to location. So usually they have considered 3 centimeter as a point. So 3 centimeter from xiphoid, subxiphoid, 3 centimeter. So 3 centimeter points they have considered for each, and we don't need to go in detail. Only thing, the diameter, they have W1, W2, W3 classified as 1 to 4, 4 to 10, and more than 10. Bailey says for the incision hernia repair, the repair should include whole length of the previous incision. If the defect is more than 2 to 3 centimeters, the mesh repair should be done, and mesh shrinkage can occur up to 50%. So that's why they say uh, lightweight, large porous mesh should be preferred, because it has a high tissue integration and the less shrinkage and high flexibility. So the all types of repair, we all know: the inlay repair, overlay repair, underlay repair, the retrorectus, we don't need to go in detail. So the retromuscular repair, usually it's done when the posterior rectus is inside 1 cm from medial edge. space is dissected for 8 to 10 centimeters, and this type of mesh doesn't require any suture because they will be kept in position with Pascal's principle only. So the inlay repair has the highest recurrence of 12.5%, while intraperitoneal repair has a low recurrence of 2.6%. Now the resting intra-abdominal pressure is usually 2 to 4 mmHg, while different activities will raise the intra-abdominal pressure like jumping to 170, cupping to 100, Valsalva to 14, standing to 20. So this is the reason we have to have a good margin of the sheath around the defect. So whenever the intra-abdominal pressure will be raised, the defect size will increase. That's why the 5 centimeter margin has been considered for the repair. Now favorable for laparoscopic repair. The gynecoid body hiatus, the reducible hernia which is in central location, abdominal wall thickness which is less than 4 centimeter, and the defect size is less than 8 centimeter. These are the favorable points for the laparoscopic repair. Now, the large loss of domain hernia or a very large incision hernia. The definition which has been given is the volume of sac which is more than 25% of volume of abdominal cavity. That is, the abdominal cavity fits measure around 1 liter, and the volume of sac is more than 250 ml, then it will become a loss of domain hernia. So various techniques has been mentioned for the repair of this hernia: preoperative pneumoperitoneum creation for several weeks, resection of momentum and column to create more space, prosthetic mesh to span uncreatable defect, or advancement flap. The latest technique, which is a Ramirez component separation technique. Now, component separation technique, variable technique has been came like anterior component, posterior component. Ramirez was the anterior component separation technique. Now, the various abdominal release procedure, the most common which is known as the anterior component separation technique, that is Ramirez technique. So, in this case, large flap will be raised 2 centimeter to linear similaris when relaxing incision will be given above postal margin to pubis. Then, if the muscle is not the defect is not closing, then we can also incise internal oblique and transverse abdominis. If it is again not approximating, then we can incise posterior rectus sheath also. So after doing all this maneuver, it can yield up to 20 centimeter of the defect. But recurrence with this procedure is seen 20% with mesh, and there is a chance of lateral bulge and mold morbidity around 26 to 63%. So to decrease the wound morbidity, another anti-circumference suppression technique has been developed, that is periumbilical perforated sparing anterior component technique. So in this case, we'll just tunnel a area from periumbilical area, and we'll create give an incision from postal margin to pubis, and will not disturb any vascularity in other places. So this technique has reduced the wound complication by 50 to 90%. Now another technique is posterior component separation technique. That is, we are incising the posterior rectus sheath 1 centimeter medial to linea seminaris. So this is the repair which is similar to retrorectus repair. This is the repair which is called a retrorectus repair, which is first mentioned by the Rives and Stopa. So the posterior circumferential technique was existing from way before the anterior circumferential technique. So the first posterior component separation technique, which is already was there, which has been given by Rives and Stopa, was a retrorectus mesh repair, in which they have given incision to posterior rectus is 1 centimeter medial to linea seminaris, and they have bring the sheath closer and place the mesh. Now another type of posterior composition separation technique is a transverse abdominis release. So in this case, we'll also give an incision to transverse abdominis muscle also. So they have a recurrence rate of 3.7 to 5%. So they are usually used whenever there is a recurrent ventral hernia after anterior component separation technique. So the incision is usually given first posterior sheath 1 centimeter medial to perforating vessel. Then transverse abdominal muscle fibers are divided with electrocautery. Then they will be separated from underlying transverse fascia. Then blunt dissection should be carried, and they should be dissected till retroperitoneum, and will visualize the psoas muscle. And then that time transverse abdominis will be more easy to come to the midline. Now the latest technique is the endoscopic component separation technique, in which transverse incision is given just the tip of 11th rib, 2 to 4 centimeter. Endoscope is introduced between the external oblique muscle and internal oblique muscle. This external oblique muscle incises 2 centimeter lateral to linea seminalis bilaterally, and in this case also wound complication has been reduced to almost 50%. Now these are the few small points given in Bailey. The risk of incisional hernia will be decreased by traditional suture. We all know that it's 1 centimeter deep to 1 centimeter apart. But recent work it has been shown smaller closure bites, that is 5 to 8 bites, both laterally and distance wise, has given a low chance of hernia rate. Now another study was there with stitch study for incisional hernia. We just need to remember the stitch study for incisional hernia. Now, the immunomodulators which has been used in the preoperative period, which will reduce the chance of incisional hernia, that is L-arginine, omega-3 or nucleotide, and preoperative 400 ml of 12.5% drink which contains maltodextrin will reduce the preoperative thirst, also reduce the postoperative insulin resistance, does lead to less postoperative losses of nitrogen and better chances of maintaining body mass and muscle strength, and less chance of developing incisional hernia. Another point we need to remember is prevention of intraoperative hypothermia. Intraoperative and continuous, there is no level 1 evidence distribute. The suture to length to wound ratio ideally which has been mentioned is 4:1, that is Jenkins rule. And this rule is based on a Pythagorean theorem, but this theorem does not consider the abdominal wall thickness. So that's why there is a debate whether there is ideal suture length should be increased to 6:1 considering the abdominal wall thickness. Another point which we need to remember is drain should not be brought out from the same wound. And latest studies has been said prophylactic mesh in high risk patient, it will reduce the hernia risk. Now the few points regarding parastomal hernia. That is parastomal highest for colostomy up to 50%. Most are asymptomatic only. And ideal treatment is stoma reversal. And simple primary facial repair will have a high recurrence, but advantage is the abdomen need not be entered. And another option can be stoma relocation with primary repair of the defect. Mesh repair, which is best placed in retromuscular space according to Bailey. 3 techniques for mesh repair has been mentioned by Sebastian. That is a sugar becker technique, keyhole technique, and resetting with mesh reinforcement. So these are the 3 techniques with 3 areas of mesh placement. Now, ideal prosthetic mesh, we all know, we don't need to go in detail of what is the ideal prosthetic mesh. Few points about polypropylene mesh, that is it's a hydrophilic, macroporous, semi-rigid, and they are somewhat flexible. While polyester are hydrophilic, macroporous, heavyweight, they allows infection to take hold, which is aided by hydrophilic, and also allow rapid vascular and cellular infiltration. PTFE are flat sheets, they do not allow any tissue ingrowth, and they usually use as a non-adhesive barrier between tissue layers. Now weight and porosity, dense and heavyweight mesh, which is called when there is a more than 80 grams per meter square, they provoke a greater reaction and collagen contraction stiffening, that is more mesh shrinkage will be there. This will lead to tissue tension and pain, and they can lead to hernia recurrence. While lightweight mesh, which are large porous, have a better tissue integration, less shrinkage, and more flexibility and improved comfort. Macroporous usually said whenever the size of the pores are more than 75 micrometers. Now, the biologic mesh we all know, humans which has been created from dermis, or porcine from submucosa intestine, bovine created from pericardium, they all will be sterilized by gamma radiation or ethylene oxide gas. Now, these are the few different type of meshes, which is not very important. The chart has been taken from Shackelford. If you want to read, you can read in detail in later. Now, this we have already seen influenza closure process of vaginalis is by calcitonin gene-related peptide and hepatocytic growth factor. And Swedish report has been given hernia risk negatively associated with BMI. And laparoscopy can detect contralateral upper hernia in 20% of the cases. There one more repair which is mentioned in Shackelford, that is Milos. That is mini open sublay repair. And this endoscopic assisted repair, dissection is taken down through hernia sac into the extraperitoneal plane, which will allow for the closure of the defect. Now, endoscopic ventral hernia repair should be done. 6 to 15 centimeter minimal invasive surgery with either Rives and Stopa or transverse abdominal release should be done. More than 15 centimeter open transverse abdominal release should be done. Recurrent hernia, if there was a no mesh, then you have to treat it as an incisional hernia. If previous mesh was there, if previous sublay was there, then we have to go for onlay repair. If previous onlay repair was there, then we have to go with either laparoscopic ventral hernia repair or open TAR. Underlay repair, then we have to go with mesh excision and open TAR. Now, a few points we all know. The hernia containing Meckel's diverticulum is, the answer will be Litter's hernia. So that's it. This ends our abdominal wall and hernia. Any question? Any doubts? Okay, thank you. Seems no queries. So hernia is a very simple topic. The simple questions will come. The more important topics are other like hepatobiliary and stomach and all. But the basic questions should not be missed. So just go through the MCQ and okay. Thank you.